Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, December 1st. And tonight, we begin with a call for ownership from HIV activists across the country on World AIDS Day. Some are calling on the federal government to honor its promises. Janet Butler McPhee is co-lead of the HIV Legal Network in Toronto, and she says the past Stephen Harper government and the current Justin Trudeau government both pledged to fund grassroots groups that serve people with HIV, but neither has followed through. Canada was recently praised internationally for pledging $1.2 billion to the Global Fund to fight AIDS in September. Well, starting today, families with an income of less than $90,000 per year can now apply for the federal government's dental benefit. Families seeking dental care can apply for the Children Under 12 applicable benefit, which can fund dental work from $260 to up to $650 per child. The government is also introducing a one-time rental supplement of $500 for low-income households beginning on December 12th. Meanwhile, the free trade agreement between Canada and the European Union is a step closer to taking full effect after it was ratified by German lawmakers today. The pact known as CETA was signed in late 2016, and most of its terms have been implemented provisionally since 2017. But it needs to be approved by all EU nations to come fully into force. A member of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's three-party coalition says they're optimistic that the remaining 11 EU countries that still need to ratify the deal will follow through very quickly. Canada's immigration programs are proving successful at helping to gradually close the gap with the United States when it comes to attracting and keeping new permanent residents. The number of permanent residents admitted to the U.S. was well below pre-pandemic levels in 2021. This while Canada welcomed the most newcomers ever in a single year. Jack Jedwab is the president of the Association of Canadian Studies, and he says immigration is the single factor driving economic growth in Canada. And the market right now is calling for more immigration to meet labor market needs. Moving to a controversial bill now put forward by Alberta's new premier. Premier Danielle Smith is rejecting accusations that her new sovereignty bill is an undemocratic, dangerous power grab. The bill would grant her cabinet sweeping powers to rewrite federal laws to protect Alberta. NDP leader Rachel Notley calls the proposed legislation an unprecedented abuse of authority. But Ms. Smith says the legislature will still be in charge. Law professor Martin Olszynski says if the UCP government truly wanted to ensure that cabinet follows the Assembly's wishes, it should have made that clear in the bill, but it didn't. Two former directors of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service say the agency's interpretation of what constitutes a national security threat is very narrow. They also say it's not relevant when it comes to a government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Ward Elcock and Richard Fadden both testified yesterday at the commission, which is probing the government's decision to invoke the Act's special powers to clear last winter's Freedom Convoy protests. Both suggest that the government should redefine national security threats in the Act and expand the definition to include threats to the economy and those posed by climate change. Turning to BC's South Coast and Vancouver Island now, which are cleaning up from Tuesday's 25-centimeter snowfall. This comes as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives estimates that the total economic costs of extreme weather events in BC last year may have hit $17.1 billion. The study factors in the real costs of last year's heat dome, wildfires, flooding, and landslides, much of it borne directly by households and businesses. The analysis goes beyond insured property damage and cleanup costs, and it includes lost wages for workers due to business closures, lost productivity, and impacts on communities. Well, on the other side of the country, an intense storm swept through the Maritimes this morning, causing power outages in all three provinces. More than 86,000 homes and businesses in Nova Scotia were in the dark at one point. Just after 10 a.m., more than 7,000 homes and businesses were without electricity on PEI, and another 7,000 NB Power customers were in the dark in central and southwestern New Brunswick. Canada's run at the World Cup has ended with a 2-1 loss to Morocco. The result leaves Canada winless at the World Cup for the second time in 36 years. Morocco, meanwhile, took the top spot in Group F. Canada was appearing at its second World Cup and first since 1986, and it was already eliminated from knockout stage contention after losses to Belgium and Croatia. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at reshoring and the Canadian economy. An interview with Brendan Caldwell from Caldwell Securities up next. Challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's war with Ukraine, and tensions with China have advocates pushing for Canada to consider reshoring, bringing more manufacturing jobs back to Canada and reducing dependence on risky countries. This comes as Canadians continue to deal with inflation and rising interest rates, making daily necessities tough to keep up with. Well, joining us now to give us his thoughts on reshoring and how it could impact Canadians is Brendan Caldwell, Director at Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima. Good to be here.
So today we're talking about deglobalization or reshoring. So what exactly does this mean for our economy and the global economy, Brendan?
Nobody knows exactly what it means, Nima, but what it seems to be meaning right now is that for the last, through my entire adulthood, which has been longer than I care to remember, and longer than even than that, the world has become more and more interdependent as manufacturing was outsourced to countries that were developing and enabled that development. China in particular, where from the time I was born to the present, China went from a highly agricultural country to one where it's the workshop of the world. That process, as a result of international tensions and unfortunately exacerbated by the COVID-19 situation, has begun to unravel as countries have begun to look to their own resources or smaller trading partnerships or groups to get what they need. And it's caused a number of things like the inflation spike that we've talked about in the last month or so.
And what would reshoring mean for companies who may already be manufacturing products in countries like China?
Well, the poster child for that right now is Apple, of course. They've got this sprawling campus, Foxconn, I think is their subcontractor, in a city called Zhengzhou. I pronounced it horribly, but they've got this worker, to say unrest is an understatement. They've got thousands of workers locked in a factory that they can't escape because of COVID concerns, and are there manufacturing Apple iPhones, or at least supposed to be, and there's been full-on riots. They say that it'll maybe cost 5% or 10% in Apple sales. Really, for the world that is so conscious of ESG, I don't know how anybody buys an Apple product for the foreseeable future. Now, I say that as a diehard BlackBerry user, but still, when basically slave labor is being used to manufacture your product and it's on the nightly news and nothing really gets out of China to that extent, unless it's got so big that they can't contain it, I don't know how you in good conscience buy an Apple product. So as the poster child for this kind of situation, I think it's really going to drive increased manufacturing, onshoring back to more friendly jurisdictions.
Some important points to consider there. Now, with new moves comes new risks, Brendan. So what are some of the challenges and uncertainties to consider here?
Well, having spent half a century sending all our production elsewhere, and not to put too fine a point on it, exporting a lot of our pollution. I mean, Toronto, where I live, used to make a lot of things, from the Inglis washing machine plant to all kinds of manufacturing. Now we don't do very much. Now, the nice thing is Lake Ontario is really clean, but we've actually exported our pollution. So bring all that production back home. How do you do it in an environmentally acceptable way? Also with jobs, yes, manufacturing back in North America is going to mean more jobs, but to keep costs lower, there's going to be a real push on to roboticize, automate, and I think if you're a young person looking for a career, figuring out how to make automation work more effectively will probably be a really great career for the foreseeable future. So in as much as, say, COVID-19 has accelerated this technology we're using now, this Zoom and video conferencing and other communications, I think this reshoring is going to really accelerate the field of robotics and automation.
All right, Brendan, we've got a quick 45 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on in terms of reshoring in Canada?
I think I answered a bigger question, Nima, and that is, for 50 years, we cared more and more about other countries for economic reasons. We cared about the development, we cared about including them in the global community, we cared about each other politically because we were doing business together. And so my biggest single concern as countries refocus on themselves is that I don't think that is going to be a recipe for the international cooperation that has been really the hallmark of my half century lifetime. We've seen more and more cooperation until the last few years, where now we're seeing less and less. I see that as a real problem, and that's the thing I'm most concerned about going forward.
Welcome back. Up now, we have Forum Daily's Market Update with Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. All yours, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, we are seeing North American equity markets somewhat mixed today, following a very nice rally yesterday on the back of Fed Chair Jerome Powell's comments, indicating that perhaps the time for moderating the pace of rate hikes could come as soon as December. That was very good news, or positive news, for the bulls in the market who have been believing that we have in fact seen peak inflation. In fact, we did get PCE, personal consumption expenditure, out this morning, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, and it came in lower than expected. So again, more confirmation that perhaps peak inflation is in the rearview mirror. That sent markets rallying, including WTI up by about 3% yesterday, 2.9% today, on track for 7% gains. It also sent the US dollar down 1% yesterday, again down 1% today. And US Treasuries were rallying on the back of the belief that we will see rates decline, sending bond prices higher. They have an inverse relationship. Importantly as well, when we think of what's next, there is concern, even though we're seeing this nice rally in the marketplace, that the economic data has in fact slowed. And that is a concern for the bulls in the market. And obviously it dovetails nicely to the bear case within the market. We did get ISM, manufacturing ISM, which contracted. It's actually the worst number we've seen since the depths of the pandemic. So in other words, the economy is slowing. You're also seeing that within various corporate results. CRM within technology, Salesforce, they did post weaker than expected results, setting that stock down by about 9% today. Costco also came in with weaker than expected November comps. And Dollar General also posted missed numbers and lowered guidance. That stock also down by about 9% today. So in other words, good news, bad news. We've got a Federal Reserve that might slow the pace of rate hikes, which is supportive for equity markets and valuations. But at the same time, a lot of questions remain in terms of what does the economic picture look like and what do corporate earnings results look like. And we're getting both of those indicators on the slowdown side, as I just mentioned, from an economic data perspective, and also corporate earnings. Having said that, we did get the Beige Book results, which tracks economic activity within the United States, and it did show that economic activity was flat to up. So again, some mixed pictures here. Away from that, holiday spending, we had the results this week from Black Friday and Cyber Monday, and it looks as though the consumer is very resilient. The results were pretty much flat to up in terms of the revenue sales numbers year over year. There is a bit of a bifurcated market, though, within retail right now. You are seeing the high end continue to perform quite well, but you are also seeing the trade down effect. So people have been affected by inflation and are trading down in terms of going to some of the more lower income oriented retail stores like the dollar stores, despite the fact that I just indicated that the Dollar General did miss and lowered guidance. Now, away from that, as we look at the TSX, it is moving higher today to the tune of 0.8%. We did see a nice rally yesterday as well. We rounded out the Canadian banks reporting their recent results with a bit of a mixed picture, although all three did raise their dividends. TD did beat expectations quite nicely, setting that stock up by over 2% today. They raised their dividend by over 7%. BMO and CIBC had slightly disappointing results, but both also raised their dividend to their investors and shareholders. Away from that, I just highlight another big news item here with the Canadian banks. RBC buying HSBC's Canadian bank assets. It's the largest domestic bank deal ever, over $13.1 billion, or call it $13.1 billion, which gives RBC about 130 branches and over 780,000 potential new clients. From an economic perspective here in Canada, we did get the GDP for third quarter coming in at 2.9%. That did beat expectations. But important to point out that that was really due to improvements within trade, whereas the domestic demand did decline. And just to point out one item within that, housing investment was down by about 15%. So domestic perhaps a little bit weaker. Lastly, putting all of this together in terms of what we're seeing in the United States as well as Canada, the BOC was expected by the market to raise rates by about 50 basis points next week. It seems though that might be coming down to, say, 25 basis points. We shall see next Wednesday. Nima, I'll leave it there. Back to you.
All right, thanks for that, Catherine. Well, stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back with a look at news from around the world, so stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. Russia's foreign minister is accusing Western powers of becoming directly involved in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Sergei Lavrov says by supplying Russia's enemy with weapons and training its soldiers, the West and NATO are undeniably involved in the conflict. Mr. Lavrov says Russia's strikes on Ukrainian energy facilities and other key infrastructure are intended to weaken Ukraine's military potential and derail the shipments of Western weapons. Meanwhile, Ukraine's main energy company says roughly 40% of the power grid isn't functioning properly after extensive damage caused by Russian shelling. Currently, 1.5 million people are still without power for an average of 12 hours a day. Well, amid widespread public anger, more Chinese cities have eased antivirus restrictions and reduced police street patrols. The change comes as the government tries to diffuse public anger and protests over some of the world's most stringent COVID measures. Experts believe the protests could ramp up even more as protesters mourn the death of former President Jiang Zemin. All right, moving to Iran now, where the government is also facing widespread public anger. Iran's national soccer team has received a subdued welcome home, with a few dozen fans greeting them in Tehran's airport. This is following their World Cup defeat against the U.S. The players returned Wednesday evening to a country still reeling from unrest from months-long demonstrations, which were held after the death of a young woman in police custody over a dress code infraction. Iran's treatment of players will likely be scrutinized because they did not sing the country's national anthem during their opening match. It was a move many considered to be a show of solidarity with anti-government protesters. All right, shifting to Africa now, where Ethiopia says a joint committee from the federal government and Tigray forces has convened to outline Tigray disarmament plans. The move comes as part of a peace deal signed last month in the two-year conflict. It is the first time the two sides have officially held talks inside of Ethiopia since the fighting began. Ethiopia's government said in a tweet on Thursday that the committee started work on Wednesday. However, Tigray officials say Ethiopia's government should remove fighters from neighboring Eritrea and neighboring Amhara regions before disarmament starts. South of our border, the United States Congress is moving urgently to head off a looming U.S. rail strike. The House passed a bill Wednesday that would bind companies and workers to a proposed settlement reached in September, which failed to gain the support of all 12 unions involved. The bill now goes to the Senate for consideration. The unions have threatened to strike if an agreement can't be reached before a December 9th deadline. Well, as the fallout from the failed cryptocurrency exchange FTX continues, its former CEO says he did not knowingly misuse customers' funds. Sam Bankman-Fried claims that he believes his millions of angry customers will eventually be made whole. His comments came during an interview yesterday with Andrew Ross Sorkin at a conference put on by the New York Times. It was Sam Bankman-Fried's first video interview since FTX filed for bankruptcy protection on November 11th. Thursday saw a change in global leadership as India officially took up its role as chair of the group of 20 leading economies for the coming year. And according to some experts, it's putting climate at the top of its group's priorities. Some say that the country will use the position to boost its climate credentials and act as a bridge between the interests of industrialized nations and developing ones. India has made considerable moves toward renewable energy, but remains one of the world's current top emitters of planet-warming gases. The latest population estimate for the world's most endangered species of whale is looking grim. A group of international experts has officially confirmed that there are only 340 North Atlantic right whales left as of last year. Now, this is a decrease of 8 whales from 2020. Though the rate of decline has slowed, researchers say these huge mammals are still struggling to stave off extinction. In 2022, only 15 calves were born, compared to an average of 24 reported in the early 2000s. Looks like Slovenia is keeping up its bee buzz on a roll. The small European nation's tradition in beekeeping is now being added to the UN's list of intangible cultural heritage as a cherished tradition to be preserved by humanity. This comes after it clinched United Nations support for its proposal to establish a World Bee Day in 2018. UNESCO experts gathering in Morocco this week decided that Slovenia's entry, Beekeeping in Slovenia, a Way of Life, deserves UN recognition. Slovenia's Ministry of Culture on Thursday said this will be an example of an important cultural tradition. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.